Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to take your seats as we begin our third panel. In formulating a national security grand strategy, far too often sanctions are considered first, and perhaps as a quote-unquote silver bullet. But should they be considered as more than an end-all be-all? And if so, what lessons can we take from situations during the Nixon years, crises that occurred during the Nixon years, in which alternative strategies led to equally or more successful conclusions? Allow me to welcome Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow and Director of the Quantum Alliance Initiative at the Hudson Institute, who is the author of 10 books, including Freedom's Forge, How American Business Produced Victory in World War II, and he will moderate this discussion and introduce our panelists.
Am I good to go? Oh, hi. How's everybody this morning? Delighted to be here with you, with our two very interesting and well-informed panelists on this topic, who've done a great deal of thinking, but also acting with regard to the theme for our panel this morning that we'll be discussing, and that is about sanctions. Sanctions as part of grand strategy. Do they work? Do they not work? When do they work? When do they not? And it's interesting, too, because sanctions have become now a very familiar weapon to be used in foreign policy and in dealing with bad actors around the world. In fact, it really has, the imposing of sanctions has really become a kind of ritual in Western governments, including the United States, as a means of bringing economic pressure, hasn't it? I mean, you'll have the White House or a prime minister will announce new sanctions against a country or a group of individuals. The members of the opposite party or members of Congress will either praise or deplore the sanctions. There will be analysis by talking heads on television and media about whether these sanctions are really going to work and what the impact will be economically, politically, geopolitically. Those who are going to be receiving the sanctions come forward with statements either of outrage about the sanctions being imposed, or they'll say nothing at all because they in fact know that there will be all kinds of ways around the imposition of these sanctions that will mean that will have absolutely really no ill effect on them or do anything to change their policy and direction. So this has become a kind of ritual here. I think the question we want to get to with this panel is, how do we make them effective? What are good examples of sanctions that can actually have an impact politically, economically, and from a grand strategy point of view? And where does history tell us that sanctions can be a bad policy choice? How do we compare sanctions with their more stringent cousins of embargoes, boycotts, or blockades? What are the choices that we need to face right now when we're facing a whole series of crises around the world? When do we use sanctions and when do we not? So that's the overall course of the discussion. What I want to do is to introduce to you our two panelists for the discussion. We have appearing with us virtually, we have Niall Ferguson, who is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, speaking to us from London. Hello, Niall.
Good to be with you, Arthur.
And we also have with us Morgan Ortagus, who is the founder of Polaris National Security and former State Department spokesperson for the man who was here on the dais last night, Mike Pompeo, but who also, from a more, should we say, from a point of view of what's relevant for our discussion this morning, who was also the Treasury attaché to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and also Treasury intel analyst, and who played, as she would tell us, an integral role in shaping the sanctions that were imposed on Iran during the previous presidential administration. But for now, what I think I want to do is to turn to Morgan first, from the context of when do sanctions work and when they don't, and what's the way in which you go about creating effective sanction policy in dealing with the wrongdoers, of whom we now have a growing cast of characters.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much to, I need to use this. I've been talking on radio all morning. I was subbing for Hugh Hewitt this morning, 6 to 9 a.m. If you missed it, hughhewitt.com. And you can see it later today. But thank you to the Nixon Foundation for having me. If you're not watching our monthly lecture series that we do with Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Robert O'Brien, you should be watching it. And I think it's one of the places where we're able to have deep intellectual conversations about everything that's happening around the world. So thank you so much to Nixon and my panelists. I come at the sanctions perspective from actually having worked across multiple Republican and Democratic administrations on sanctions. In the Bush administration, whenever I was at the Treasury Department as a financial intelligence analyst, and then later in the Obama administration when I was their attaché to Saudi Arabia, that was in President Obama's first term. Bush's second term, obviously. And we were, of course, really focused back then on the original sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, which eventually forced them to the negotiating table in 2015. So first of all, I would say we could go into a lot of Iran examples, which I'm sure we'll get to today. But when you look at sanctions writ large, they should not be the end-all, be-all strategy. They should not be the silver bullet. And they certainly should not be a tool in which an administration uses because the administration is afraid to use a credible threat of force. So what I mean by that, and I think this often happens too often in the Obama and now Biden administrations, is that in the absence of having a deterrent, a threat of military force that people actually believe, we tend to use sanctions to try to change behavior. Sanctions in and of themselves are never going to change behavior. It has to be a comprehensive strategy that you have towards Iran or to Russia in the case of Ukraine, and it should just be one of many tools. So you'll hear a lot today. I'm sure Niall has thoughts about the overuse of sanctions, how that could impact the dominance of the US dollar around the world, and I think that these are all very credible arguments. I would argue that sanctions should not be used the way the Biden administration is currently using them. And what do I mean by that? One of the most dangerous things that are happening on the world stage today is the lack of enforcement of sanctions that are on the books. So as we all know, for the past 3 years, the Biden administration has not enforced the maximum economic pressure campaign sanctions that we put on Iran in the last administration. And so because of that, we took Iranian oil basically almost down to zero. And we did not, by the way, raise the price of oil for the American consumer because we did this magic little thing, which is called actually working with our producers, our oil producers, our energy producers here at home so that we could supply for our own energy needs. So because we are not enforcing the sanctions against Iran, Iran has about roughly $80 billion over the last 3 years in additional revenue that they have gleaned from oil sales because they have not been enforced. They also have not been properly enforced in Venezuela. And we just see today that the administration is likely going to lift sanctions against Venezuela, some of them for a deal with Maduro, for a deal that Maduro and the opposition made. So what happens in one theater affects another theater. We know, for example, when Kabul fell to the Taliban and we saw that disastrous withdrawal that took 13 of our best young men and women, we know when that happened, that had reverberations, that had consequences. We know that gave Putin the gumption to think, you know what, I can probably invade Ukraine and get away with it. And you've seen what's happened in every theater since the fall of Kabul to the Taliban. I say that as an example because I believe strongly whenever you don't enforce sanctions against Iran or Venezuela, then you see everybody backsliding against sanctions against North Korea or other states. So it's never just isolated to one case. The reason why the Biden administration did not remove the Iran sanctions and decided just not to enforce them is because they knew it would be political suicide for them. So I guess we can go much deeper into Iran and Russia. I have lots of thoughts about the current sanctions regime against Russia, which is largely ineffective, as we all know. And again, the reason I would say is because I don't think this administration has a comprehensive strategy for how they are going to deter Iran and Russia. And instead, in the absence of the credible threat of military force, they are using sanctions to try to change behavior. And sanctions are never going to work to change behavior if they are the whole strategy as opposed to a tactic within a broader strategy.
Thank you. We can talk about, we will be talking more about Iran and what approaches to take in order to make those sanctions enforceable again. The other country which has been the subject of a lot of sanctions talk, particularly in Congress, as well as the current administration, is China. And we've seen a lot of clamor on the part of Capitol Hill for imposing sanctions or imposing embargoes, and I'm going to link those two together here because they are in many ways, well, not exactly synonymous. They do follow the same pattern of ways in which to punish and to impose penalties on countries or groups who are seen as wrongdoers, as not good players in the international community. With the case of China, we've seen this with efforts to shut down their access to various forms of advanced technology. Most recently, the sanctions that were imposed with regard to high-end AI chips that NVIDIA was making, and had even made adjustments and adapted to the previous round of sanctions regarding those chips, in which now suddenly NVIDIA realizes that they've raised the bar as to what's acceptable to sell to China, which has had a bad effect on NVIDIA's stock price and their economic fortunes as well. Now, Neil, you recently published a column in Bloomberg talking about this kind of sanctions regime, specifically when it comes to China. And I think the message there is that be careful what you wish for, because the imposition of these kinds of sanctions and freeze-outs of advanced technologies can become itself an escalating ladder towards growing levels of economic warfare. And that what you could see is a situation in which this becomes I think the term you used was mutually assured destruction, in which both the U.S. and the Chinese economies suffer serious, even irreparable loss over time through this kind of use of sanctions as a way to either to decouple from China, right, in the part of the U.S. side of it, or in China's way to respond to the efforts to shut them and their companies and their government out from access to U.S. technology. You want to talk a little bit about how you see this term mutually assured destruction entering into discussion about sanctions and embargoes and everything else that we're going to be talking about today?
Yes, I want to make it clear that I agree with just about everything Morgan just said there, in particular about how not to use sanctions. And if anything has illustrated the way in which this administration misunderstands deterrence, it has to be the successive failures to deter Russia and to deter Iran. Sanctions were eased on Russia prior to 2022. Let's not forget the sanctions were lifted on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in 2021. It was one of the signals that the Russians were going to push against a relatively open door if they escalated their aggression in Ukraine. And we see a similar pattern now with Iran emboldened by those additional 80 or perhaps more billion to engage in shameless aggression against Israel through its proxies, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and perhaps soon Hezbollah. So I don't think we're going to have one of those punch and Judy type disagreements on this panel, Morgan. What I want to do is add a couple more points to your critique. One important lesson of history is that when you use sanctions, economic measures to impose costs on an enemy, even if you do it as part of a full-scale military effort, there can be unintended consequences. And one good example, which is worth thinking about, is the way Britain imposed very sweeping and aggressive economic sanctions on Germany at the outbreak of World War I. My good friend Nick Lambert has some terrific research on this, showing that these were so successful that there was massive blowback to the UK economy. The radical decoupling that they imposed on the outset of the war, in fact, turned out to have significant costs to the UK that hadn't been foreseen. So I think whenever one engages in some artificial cost that one imposes on an adversary, one has to remember that one's tampering with the very complex system that is the global market economy. And it's not necessarily a case of other things remaining equal. There are unintended consequences. And a great theme of Nick Lambert's work has been the ways in which economic warfare we used and abused and often had unintended consequences in that huge conflict, which was in many ways the birth of the modern era of economic warfare. The other example, which I think you were alluding to, Arthur, is that against Japan in the 1930s and right up until the outbreak of war between the United States and Japan with Pearl Harbor, the US kept ratcheting up the economic pressure on Japan in a variety of ways, including an oil embargo. And ultimately, the unintended consequence was to force the imperial government to take massive strategic risk because it faced a choice between doing that or just accepting that it couldn't possibly run a meaningful Asian empire and just had to accept second-class status. And I think when one looks at the things that have been done by the Biden administration to China, the Commerce Department regulations on semiconductors that you mentioned, Arthur, are really interesting in this respect because they're really much tougher than anything the Trump administration did to China. Compared with the tariffs or the things that were done to Huawei, if you cut China off from the most sophisticated semiconductors, including those manufactured at TSMC in Taiwan, if you make sure that they can't get the machinery that you need to make the high-end semiconductors and the people, if you basically shut them out, that is a very profound threat to China's ambitions to be an AI superpower on a par with the United States. There are only two AI superpowers, US and China. And so I think we may underestimate the amount of pressure that set of economic sanctions has created on Xi Jinping. And who knows what conclusion he may draw. But in effect, we've presented China with three options. Option one, just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, well, it's an American world. We better just learn to live with it. Number two, let's try and replicate TSMC on the mainland, which looks like something that would be really hard for them to do if you ask the experts in this area. And number three is just let's take over Taiwan. It's right there. We think it's ours. We say it's ours. Pretty much the Americans accept it's a one China world. So why not just take it? And if that issue surfaces right now, if China imposes a blockade on Taiwan and says, well, here's some economic warfare. How do you like this? We control the ins and outs, who goes in, what goes into Taiwan. We'll be in a tremendous strategic dilemma at that moment. We've got a crisis in Ukraine. We've got a crisis in the Middle East. A third crisis over Taiwan would create major dilemmas for American military planners. And that's a very good example of the kind of unintended consequences that sanctions can have.
I'm going to press you a little bit on that, on a couple of points there. One is it really fair to compare the oil embargo against Japan, Imperial Japan in the 30s, with the sanctions regarding high-tech
Yeah,
equipment and semiconductors in this case. I mean, in the case of Japan, after all, being totally dependent on foreign imports of oil, it really meant a complete shutdown of the economy, including its military. In China's case, certainly it would cramp its long-term strategy, its desire to become the leading AI nation and high-tech nation in the future. I think one of the worries is not so much that by cutting off U.S. exports of these kinds of semiconductors and other advanced technology to China has been, on the part of other commentators, has been that what will happen is the Chinese will just simply learn how to make it themselves. That basically, and you've already seen that with the case of the 7mm semiconductors for 5G, that Huawei, you impose a boycott on Huawei equipment, fine, we'll go make our own stuff. And so what you've done is basically postpone what the real issue is. But I'm going to press you again, Neil. I'm going to say, what the hell, Neil? I mean, this is stuff that's going to the Chinese military direct, thanks to civil military fusion. What can we do to prevent that U.S. technology from going directly into the service of the PLA and the PLAN, unless we impose some kind of sanctions or some kinds of limits as to how that technology goes? So, my question for you then is, if the current regime of limiting China's access to U.S. technology is not working, or could even have disastrous unintended consequences, from your point of view, what could be effective as a way in which to limit China's access to the technologies that they need to basically compete with us, not just in the economic sphere, but also to prevail against us in the military sphere?
Well, Arthur, one of the things that made me think much harder about this issue was several years ago realizing that China spent more on importing semiconductors than it spends on importing oil. So I think the parallel is actually a legitimate one, because in many ways, semiconductors are as important, if not more important, than oil today. And if you limit China's access to the most sophisticated of these semiconductors, it can't compete in, say, the domain of large language models. And the reality of the Huawei chips you mentioned is that they're uneconomic to make. I mean, that's a really, really difficult thing to do. And so I think one should not underestimate how effective this strategy is at inflicting pain on China. I give credit to Jake Sullivan, who's one of the architects of this vision that you kind of do technological containment. I think it's an entirely intelligent way of dealing with the Chinese challenge. But the point I want to make is that you must remember that your opponent has options other than just accepting second-class status. I don't think it's as easy as you just made it sound for China to catch up. I remember asking Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, if China could catch up with TSMC, and he replied, they're 5 years behind us now, but 5 years ago they were 5 years behind us, and in 5 years' time they'll be 5 years behind us. He was highly skeptical that the mainland would be able to replicate the achievement of TSMC. And I think we've made it even harder by our sanctions. So the key point I want to emphasize is that if you are going to impose pressure on an East Asian nation with imperial tendencies, you should be ready for them to take strategic risk in response. The United States was not ready for Pearl Harbor, and the costs of being surprised were extraordinarily high, and they were borne by a generation of young Americans who had to claw America's way back into dominance in the Pacific. I think we are creating a much shorter pathway to conflict with China than many people realize. I hear conventionally argued, oh, well, China's not going to be ready to invade Taiwan until 2027, which in Washington is the infinitely distant future because it's beyond the next presidential election. But in reality, that's really soon. And in any case, they don't need to invade Taiwan. They could do a blockade tomorrow. And because we've moved away from strategic ambiguity, and we now have kind of a more or less unambiguous commitment to do something if that happens, I think the president could find himself in the very difficult position of having to send another couple of aircraft carrier strike groups, this time to the Taiwan Strait. And unfortunately, unlike in 1996, the Chinese now have the capacity to sink aircraft carrier strike groups. So I think we've got to be careful here. The assumption that China won't do what Russia did and won't do what Iran is doing is a very complacent assumption. And it's a dangerous one, given that China is a far more formidable adversary than Russia or Iran. The point I'm really making is not that sanctions don't work. Sometimes they work too well. They work better than you realize. And they create an appetite for risk in your adversary that you underestimate at your peril.
Morgan, when thinking about China, and I know that was very much part of the discussion and thinking about what the U.S.'s stance with regard to China and China's access to U.S. technology during the previous administration. When thinking about sanctions with regard to China, are there important lessons that can be learned from the Iran example?
Absolutely. First, I agree with a lot of what Neil just said, but in my mind, the Chinese calculation about what they are going to do or not do and win over Taiwan is baked in the cake. I don't know that I necessarily think that our sanctions are going to push them there. I think that it is Xi Jinping's red line. It is personal to his identity to get Taiwan back in his mind. It's more personal than probably, in many ways than Crimea is in the Russia. Or maybe it's analogous. So I don't know that sanctions are going to push China to do that. China's going to get Taiwan back in whatever means necessary because it is existential to them and their mind and the mind of this regime to get Taiwan back. But saying that, I do want to step back. We could definitely compare and contrast the Iran sanctions from the last administration, from the Trump administration, and the Russian sanctions as well. But I also want to remind our viewers who are watching at home, thank you very much, and people here in the audience, that there are different types of sanctions. It doesn't just have to be countrywide sanctions. In fact, during the global war on terror, we used quite effectively sanctions against individuals and entities that were providing support to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS. We worked, in the last administration, we worked very aggressively on getting other countries to do things like declaring Hezbollah a terrorist organization. I forget how many countries we were able actually to do, but that was a big push to get people to actually recognize Hamas and Hezbollah as terror organizations. And so after 9/11, at the United States Treasury, when we really founded the Terrorism and Sanctions Office that we have today, we were aggressively going after individuals and entities that were funding terrorism, especially to, at the time, right after 9/11, to the Sunni groups like Al-Qaeda. And that's really important, number one, I think, because there is the naming and shaming element, right? If you are an individual, if you or your company are providing illicit support, that should be something that banks around the world should understand. And I also think, too, we also have to differentiate between sanctions placed by the United States and sanctions that are multilateral sanctions. So that would be sanctions that maybe come out of US and EU together, or sanctions or entities list notifications that are put on from the United Nations. We obviously know that for sanctions to be the most effective, you want to have multilateral sanctions. US sanctions in and of itself can be certainly effective at getting American businesses not to do business with a particular individual or entity. But the hope always, of course, so when I was back in my 20s, which was just a few years ago. Oh, good, everybody's waking up. Thanks for laughing at that. But when I was back in my 20s, when I was an intelligence analyst at the Treasury, when we were building sanctions packages against these individuals and entities that were supporting terrorism, we had the U.S. threshold, the package that we would build, which was very high. But we always built the U.S. sanctions that was typically under a presidential executive order. We always tried to build those packages with the the hopes that it would be significant enough to also get that individual or entity sanctioned at the UN. Because if you could get it done at the UN, that meant things like a red notice so the person couldn't travel, and that way more countries would be obliged to actually go after that particular entity or individual for their support to terrorism. So I do think, while it seems maybe minor, I do think that there is a point to make sure that we're differentiating between what sanctions are put in by the United States only versus multilateral sanctions, which can obviously largely be more effective, and to remember that sanctions aren't just country specific. In the case of the global war on terror, which apparently we're back in again, we really were able to go after not only Al-Qaeda and Hamas and others, we were able actually to go after Mexican drug cartels, incredibly effective in shutting down the Cali cartel, for example. I think that was around 2014 when that Cali cartel was completely dismantled. So wanted to just make sure that we share those nuances and know that sanctions are not monolithic. There's a bunch of different kinds. And that goes right into the comparing and contrasting the maximum economic pressure campaign sanctions against Iran versus what we saw the sanctions package that Biden and his team put on Russia. It was incredibly unfortunate, as Neil mentioned, that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which we sanctioned quite heavily in the Trump administration, that was one of the, I think, 10 or 12 things that I've looked at that I think really led to the failure of deterrence that allowed Putin or gave him the gusto and the bravado to think that he could invade Ukraine without impunity. Not only did we stop the military aid that the Trump administration, the lethal assistance that the Trump administration was giving to Ukraine, the Biden administration stopped that. They also stopped any new sanctions. And basically, Jake Sullivan told the world, we're only going to do all of these things if Russia actually invades. So arming your enemy, after they've already been invaded is a peculiar way of deterrence. I'm going to just go out on a limb here and say maybe that didn't work, especially when you saw that we greenlit Nord Stream 2. So at the end of the day, the maximum economic pressure campaign was instituted after we withdrew from the JCPOA because we saw two big flaws in the JCPOA. Number one, we all knew that Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, chants death to Israel and death to America. Unfortunately, the Obama negotiators, led by the brilliant climate czar John Kerry, a lot of dripping with sarcasm, the Obama team, I guess, thought that the only way that Iran could destroy the state of Israel, which has been their stated goal for 40 years, was through a nuclear weapon. They forgot about these pesky things called ballistic missiles. They forgot about Iran's rampant funding to terrorist groups, to their Shia proxies throughout the region. And as we have unfortunately seen in the last week and a half, starting on October 7th, that we should have believed the Iranian regime when they said that they wanted to destroy Israel and wipe it off the face of the map. They were happy to do it, I think, via a nuclear weapon, but they're also just as happy to do it via their terrorist proxies, via their massive ballistic missile arsenal, if that is what is most effective to achieving their goal. So when we left the JCPOA, we knew one of the main things that we had to do to hurt the regime was not to put sanctions on the regime that would be a slap on the wrist. We knew that we needed to take Iranian oil off the market. And so that's where you get things like not only the initial US sanctions, but secondary sanctions. All the fancy terminology and lingo essentially boils down to telling Japan, working with India, working with China and other countries around the world to get them to stop buying Iranian oil. And for all intents and purposes, because we were willing to take the hard step of secondary sanctions, because we were willing to increase production here in the United States, and because we were willing to draw a very firm line of not taking Iranian oil, I do think that those sanctions, from the perspective of taking legitimate Iranian oil sales off the market, was incredibly effective. And again, you will remember we did not have the big price jumps in the price of gasoline for Americans that you've had. compare and contrast that to what I think is a very paltry sanctions regime that the Biden team has placed on Russia. I think it's mostly an exercise in making everybody feel like they're doing something without being effective. We know that the ruble is trading higher today than it was at the start of their invasion. We know that clearly Iranian oil still continues to flow. We've not inhibited that at all. We haven't done secondary sanctions against Russia for their oil, so we've done nothing to effectively take it off the market. And we did do some banking sanctions, but we exempted all of the banks that are doing energy transactions. So I actually think that the sanctions package on Russia is dangerous from the perspective of someone who does believe in the effectiveness of the entities list of sanctions, whether it's for countries, individuals, entities. The most dangerous thing you could do is to half-ass sanctions. And that's exactly what the Biden administration has done with Russia. They're not willing to actually take the measures to take oil off the market. It's all an exercise to make everybody feel like they're doing something without actually doing anything.
Well, that's a rather familiar theme, isn't it, with the imposition of sanctions, is a feeling like, well, we've got to do something, and the easiest thing we can do to express our moral outrage is by imposing sanctions. Neil, the example that comes to my mind, which I think sort of fed the vogue for economic sanctions over the last quarter century or so, was the example of South Africa, where you had multilateral sanctions against the apartheid regime. The idea of it was that this would force them into changing their policy and changing their political and apartheid system. And within 2 years, that's exactly what happened. In part because people did not realize that, or did not think through the fact that the South African regime was prepared to abandon apartheid. They were just looking for an opportunity and a way in which to do that. And so the international effort to boycott South Africa seemed like an amazing triumph of moral will over political and economic circumstances, which I think has encouraged people to think about sanctions as being a way in which you can very quickly and cheaply strike a blow against regimes that you see as wrongdoers or as being, in some ways, a dangerous presence in the world stage, and that you can even force regime change or even force major changes in the political and economic system as a result.
Yeah, I can remember being caught up in that whole anti-apartheid campaign as a very young boy. I think the delusion was that was why apartheid had come to an end, when in reality it was as much the end of the Cold War. And before that, the pretty clear signal from the United States that it would not sustain white minority rule in Southern Africa, a signal which dates back to Richard Nixon's administration, of course, and a signal that got even louder under Gerald Ford. So I think we fail often in telling ourselves historical narratives to acknowledge the relative importance of the different variables. And I don't think sanctions are the reason apartheid ended. Apartheid ended partly because it was an unsustainable fascist regime with just enormous and ultimately insuperable obstacles to maintaining white minority rule. You'll have noticed it doesn't exist anywhere, white minority rule. And that's not, I think, because of sanctions. But I'd like to try and contextualize this debate, because it seems to me that for every successful sanctions campaign, there seem to be at least 3 unsuccessful ones. I haven't noticed regime change in Cuba lately, and Cuba's been under sanctions for an extraordinarily long time. And Cuba's a relatively easy place to sanction, unlike, say, Russia. It's a relatively small island. And I think part of what has happened, particularly since the end of the Cold War, is that we've started to exaggerate the power of sanctions and forget where they failed. And this, I think, led to an exaggeration of what could be done against Russia. Even after the war had failed, sanctions clearly weren't a deterrent. Completely agree with you there. But then they didn't even become a particularly useful and effective weapon of war, although they were sold as such at the beginning of the war. And why have we exaggerated the power of sanctions in recent times and started to think that it's a sort of solution to any problem in international relations? I think it's partly because the discovery of financial sanctions, as opposed to trade sanctions or restrictions on technology after 9/11, exposed a kind of superpower that the United States hadn't previously appreciated that it had. I mean, I think of Juan Zarate's work on this. It was suddenly clear that really financial sanctions were something that the United States had never properly used before, but when used, they could do a lot. And really, that encouraged the sense that the United States didn't need to get so mixed up with boots on the ground and all that tough stuff. It had this super weapon. And I think it started to get overused. And with that, you create the obvious hazard, which I think it's worth discussing. Morgan alluded to it, that if you overuse the financial sanctions, you incentivize China and its allies to create a parallel financial system that doesn't include SWIFT and doesn't include the different things that we've used, particularly against Russia. I think this is worth watching because although it's not like the yuan is going to replace the dollar, much less some sort of fake BRICS currency. Nevertheless, if I look ahead 10 years, I would expect more transactions in RMB to take place between China and its trading partners, more offshore renminbi centers to operate. It's just that we can't expect the Chinese to be as susceptible to financial sanctions when there's a showdown with them as the Russians were to financial sanctions when there was a showdown with them. And I'll add one final point, which brings back Richard Nixon to the conversation. In the Cold War, Nixon was especially adept at using sanctions to extract concessions, improvements, a better behavior from regimes that the United States could do more trade with. We forget that part of the opening to China, which was in many ways the pivotal moment of the Nixon presidency, it began by offering improvements in economic relations. And this was something that they also did with members of the Eastern Bloc in Europe that weren't particularly pro-Soviet, like Romania. So I think it's worth remembering that sanctions are a lever in a different sense. You can offer your counterparty improved trade relations to try and improve their behavior. And that, of course, was part of what détente was supposed to deliver, though how far it succeeded remains, I think, a matter for heated debate.
It's interesting you should mention Nixon in this context, because I think the other theme that is worth thinking about with regard to sanctions, which was a theme of the Nixon-Kissinger approach to foreign policy, was the idea of linkage. That, in other words, that you can bring sanctions or threaten sanctions in order to change behavior in some specific area, instead of simply a blanket sanctions as a punitive measure. You think of it as leverage to force changes in other respects, in other directions here. And I think when you look through Nixon's papers and his reflections on these kinds of issues, you see a really deep skepticism about sanctions, and particularly about the idea of a complete sanction regime, the kind that you mentioned, Cuba, for example, which has had so little effect. And in one of his writings in 1992, he says this, which I want to get comments from both of you. He says, if we use our ultimate weapon, total economic sanctions, we will squander our greatest asset for only marginal returns. Sanctions held in reserve are more powerful than sanctions put into place.
Yeah, far be it from me to argue with Richard Nixon. And I think I largely agree with that quote. I mean, if you just look at the context of Iran and Russia, let's just say fast forward in 2 years, I'm talking to you as a part of the next Republican administration, if we win, please God. I don't know that we can put the genie back in the bottle as it relates to Iran, for example. The genie is already out now over the past 3 years. So we used enormous political capital in order to get India and China and Japan and others not to purchase Iranian oil, as an example. And I don't know that that genie can be put back in the bottle. So we will absolutely have to we'll have to see where the Russian Ukraine war is. We have, I think in many ways that fight has been in somewhat of a stalemate over the past 6 months, not a lot of advances from either side. So the next administration could, if Republican or Democrat, but from my perspective, if it's a Republican administration, you will inherit a challenge of weak sanctions on Russia that didn't actually stop them in their advances towards Ukraine over the past 20 months. And at that point, for 2.5 years, you will inherit, and we'll see what goes down in the Middle East over the next week and a half, but you could potentially, inherit an Iran that has been completely emboldened through their oil revenue, and the sanctions, while still on the books, haven't been enforced for so many years that they are largely ineffective. And so at that point, I would argue it's better to take ineffective sanctions off the book, or actually make the decision, no, we are going to enforce them. But enforcing them, which I think we should do, does require enormous political capital. Enforcing sanctions means that the president and his Secretary of State or her Secretary of State and the Treasury Secretary have to use enormous leverage. They have to take enormous political risk, and they have to be willing to lead. And so far, in the past 3 years, we have an administration that has instituted things like a price cap, which Secretary Yellen instituted on Russia, which has been largely ineffective. So I think there's, I think we are talking about on variations of a theme here. I do agree with Neil that for every successful campaign, which I would say our maximum economic pressure sanctions against Iran were successful. For every one of those, you can find plenty of examples where it hasn't been effective. I do think when you look at the examples in the places where it wasn't effective, Neil brought up Cuba, for example. It's places where the sanctions were not easily understood. They were not easily enforceable. They were not adaptable. They weren't tailored sanctions. They were just sort of this blanket monolithic sanction that didn't actually, make room for humanitarian exemptions, for example.
Neil? Neil, in looking at the Nixon formula of using the threat of sanctions as a way in which to bring about changes in behavior, particularly in specific areas, let's say, through a linkage policy. Do you see ways in which that could be adopted in terms of dealing with China?
Well, I think, and in this I'm quite unfashionable, that we would be better off pursuing a policy of détente than risking confrontation over Taiwan in the near term when I don't think we're ready for it. My understanding of Nixon's détente was that it was a way of buying time as the United States recovered from the debacle in Vietnam, and it was time that was valuable to the United States. I think the way Richard Nixon thought about sanctions was as part of a very complex system of bargaining with other states, where the carrots and sticks would be very finely maneuvered, and you would extract leverage, as you say, you'd extract gains by that process. Now, of course, sanctions were sometimes used in quite a clearly punitive way against the Allende regime in Chile. Most notoriously, people like to talk about that. But if you look at the Latin American policy as a whole, there was a lot of quite subtle use of sanctions, and sometimes a kind of forbearance. There were times when U.S. companies were nationalized by regimes in Peru, for example, when Nixon actually opted not to impose sanctions. It's a much more complex story than I think is generally understood, because he just saw it as one of many tools in his very sophisticated toolbox for trying to exert pressure and to give incentives to countries to behave better. You're right to bring up linkage. The ultimate linkage was to try to get some kind of better outcome in Vietnam. That wasn't successful. But I think if you look at what was done exactly 50 years ago, you see two very striking things, one of which we just haven't thought about in this conversation and need to. Number one, that faced with a crisis in the Middle East that threatened the existence of Israel, the attack on the Yom Kippur War by Egypt and Syria, the United States moved extremely effectively to support Israel, but also to stop the fighting and use its diplomatic leverage to bring about a substantial improvement in Israel's position, namely the paving of the way to peace between Egypt and Israel. And one of the ways in which that was achieved was with the credible threat of force at a critical moment when the Soviets looked like they were going to intervene. I'm still waiting to hear a credible threat of the use of force against Iran from President Biden, despite the very fine speech that he gave yesterday. The second point is that sanctions were done to the United States. We haven't talked about that. But remember, the most powerful sanctions of the 1970s were the oil embargo imposed on the United States and other countries by the Saudis and the other Arab members of OPEC in the wake of the Yom Kippur War. That was one of the unintended consequences of that whole episode. And it had profound economic costs for the United States and indeed the world economy. We should never forget that we're not always the subject of the sentence where sanctions are concerned. We can be the object.
That's right. And by the way, for the audience and for Neil, if you want to join us, we have a panel this afternoon on the 50th anniversary of the Arab oil embargo and the OPEC price rise, and the worldwide, as well as the implications for American economy, the worldwide impact of that change. And speaking directly on this issue of unintended consequences, Neil and Morgan, I would remind you, just as a last thought here, that one of the consequences of that Arab oil embargo, and we have to remember, for those of you who were not here, that in the course of a year, the price of a barrel of oil jumped from $2.50 a barrel to $11.65 a barrel. That one of the consequences was that the Nixon White House and Security Council seriously debated using military force as a way to seize the oil fields in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, because the threat to American economic security was so grave that it seemed that military force might have to be the final option until the embargo was negotiated out in the spring of 1974. So in that sense, when we were talking about the Japanese oil embargo of the 1930s, 1939, and when we talk about the Arab oil embargo, watch out what you wish for. Because countries can react in ways that you had not anticipated, including the use of military force as their last option. Final thoughts, Morgan and Neil?
Well, which is exactly why there has been this ongoing discussion for many years now about onshoring and nearshoring, being able to, such a novel concept, being able to provide for our own energy security here at home, our own food security, our own pharmaceuticals. I think we are still, 95% dependent on China for our generic medicines, almost completely dependent on them for penicillin. So I think the examples that you gave from Japan and from the 70s oil embargo, I think only can re-emphasize the conversation that we are having around making sure that our national security critical things like energy, like food, like medicine can actually be produced and procured here in the United States. And then finally, I would just say, we have seen, to bring it full circle to what I said at the beginning, one of the reasons why I think sanctions have not been effective in the way that the Biden administration has deployed them is because there isn't the credible use of force backing them up. No one is scared. No one is intimidated. You've got the vice president saying to migrants coming over our undefended and wide open southern border, don't come. Since she said the words don't come, we've probably had at least 1 million gotaways into this country, untold numbers from China, from Iran. These are not just people from the Northern Triangle fleeing economic hardship. So you have the vice president issuing warnings to people not to come over the southern border, and then 1 million more people come after that speech. You have Secretary Austin just a few days ago, who sort of, issued his version of a threat to anybody who might want to get involved and escalate the conflict over Israel and Gaza. And he said, don't do it, something like that. Since he said that, what do we see happen overnight? We've seen at least 3 of our bases in Syria attacked. We have seen Iran's proxy forces from Hezbollah and others. Basically, they have moved, they've positioned themselves, they've encircled Israel. So no one is listening to the threats and to the warnings from this administration. Listen, I greatly do not want to be critical of them. I want them to reestablish deterrence, but we have a policy writ large around the world which is avoiding escalation at all cost. And that appeasement policy, that avoidance of escalation policy that they are pursuing is actually making the problems in almost every theater escalate. It's making the world far more dangerous. It's making the world less safe. And the Middle East that was, everyone said, would blow up in the Trump administration and create World War III, we're seeing it today because there is no credible threat of force, because there is no deterrence that has been reestablished, and because the policy of let's avoid escalation at all costs, that policy is making every conflict, in my mind, get much worse and actually forcing the escalation that they're trying to avoid.
Neil, I'm going to give you the last word.
I'll keep it brief, as Morgan was so eloquent. The great category error is to think of sanctions as an alternative to military force. They're not. And they really actually only tend to achieve things if there is an accompanying threat, even if it's only an implicit one, of military force. We're going to see play out in the coming weeks some world historical events. I wish I knew which way it's going to go. I hope, like Morgan, I hope the administration is successful in deterring Iran and its proxies from escalating the war against Israel. But I think it's very clear to everybody, I'm hoping by the end of this discussion, that they're not going to achieve that outcome by talking about sanctions. They're only going to achieve that outcome if there's a credible threat of large-scale US military action against Iran and its proxies, perhaps including Iran's nuclear sites. Without that, I very much fear that there'll be another protracted conflict, as in Ukraine, which will leave Israel in its weakest state, perhaps in its history, certainly in a weaker state than it was 50 years ago when Richard Nixon was still president.
I hope those of you here in the audience will be able to join us for our afternoon panel, when we'll be exploring more of these issues in a discussion about energy security and the 50th anniversary of the Arab oil embargo. But for now, I think we all want to thank our guests and our panelists for an absolutely fascinating discussion.
Thanks very much.